The studio lights in London cast an icy glow over the sleek, polished floor. Cameras rolled silently, capturing every micro-expression, every twitch of discomfort, every bead of sweat. At the heart of the broadcast room, on opposite sides of a glass table, sat two men. One represented centuries of power and empire, cloaked in the polished charisma of Western media. The other was young, intense, cloaked not in diplomacy, but in raw conviction. Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso. The host, a man known across the globe for his aggressive interviewing style and moral posturing, adjusted his tie, then looked directly into the camera. His voice was smooth, theatrical, and sharpened like a blade. "President Traoré," he began, "you call yourself a liberator, but you took power by force. You expelled French troops. You censored the press. You call it freedom. The world calls it tyranny. Explain yourself." The young African president did not blink. His posture was firm, his eyes unwavering, his tone devoid of panic or apology. "When we were children," Traoré began, "we learned that our nations were independent. We celebrated false flags on paper-thin sovereignty. Yet when we asked our governments why we had no hospitals, no roads, no weapons to defend ourselves, they blamed poverty. Not the looting, not the decades of plunder, not the unequal treaties or puppet leaders propped up by men like you." There was a pause. The interviewer smiled tightly, trying to hold the upper hand. "Are you suggesting Burkina Faso was occupied by France until recently? That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" Traoré leaned forward, his voice like the low rumble of distant thunder. "What do you call it when your army sits on our land uninvited? When your corporations extract our gold while our people starve? When your banks hold our reserves, and your media mocks us when we resist?" The studio's atmosphere thickened. The host attempted to pivot, an old trick, press the emotional button. "All right, let's talk about the people. The Burkinabe, aren't they afraid of what comes next? Civil unrest, economic collapse, possible war." Traoré's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "They've lived in fear for 60 years. But not of me, of you, of coups planned in Paris cafes, of sanctions imposed because we dared to stand tall. When I walk in our villages, mothers tell me, 'Don't bow.' Children draw our flag and say, 'Make us proud.' That is who I answer to." The host hesitated. He had expected deflection, not defiance. A producer signaled for him to change topic. Time to return to the West's favorite narrative. Corruption, chaos, instability. "Let's be honest, Mr. Traoré," he said with condescension. "Africa has a history of failed revolutions. What makes you different?" Traoré's reply was slow, precise. "Because we remember. Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, they were not failures. They were assassinated, not by their people, but by empires afraid of black dignity. We are not repeating history. We are continuing it." The studio fell silent. For a moment, even the buzzing electronics seemed to hold their breath. Traoré then turned to the camera, not to the interviewer, not to the producers, but to the millions watching from Abidjan to Algiers, from Paris to Port-au-Prince. "I do not come here to entertain," he said. "I came here because truth deserves a stage, because my people deserve to see one of their own say, 'Enough. We are not your pawns. We are not your markets. We are not your security risk. We are a people reclaiming their future.'" Outside the studio, in the streets of Ouagadougou and Bamako, in the refugee camps and the schools, in the prisons where dissidents once disappeared, a spark ignited. A new generation watched the interview not with fear, but with fire. They did not see a warlord. They saw a farmer's son speaking of land, a soldier speaking of peace, a man who risked his life not for power, but for presence. The presence of a people long erased from the global table. The broadcast ended. The host removed his microphone. his eyes clouded with confusion. He had not defeated his guest with logic or shame. Traoré had left untouched, unsilenced, and perhaps even more dangerous than before. In the corridors of Western power, the interview triggered alarm. Think tanks labeled him a populist demagogue. Newspapers questioned his mental state. Embassies drafted reports filled with veiled threats and budget proposals for more stabilization missions. But on the continent, the ground shifted. Flags waved that night, not just the national ones, but those stitched with Pan-African colors. The colors of solidarity, of resistance, of hope. Young people who had never known sovereignty began to imagine it. Weeks later, as sanctions tightened and drones hovered at borders, Traoré stood in the countryside with volunteers rebuilding schools with clay and conviction. Foreign investment halted, but the people planted millet. Aid agencies withdrew, but communities pooled grain. And every time someone asked him, "Are you afraid of what they'll do to you?" he replied the same. "I'm afraid of what they'll keep doing to us if no one stands up." The war was not over. It had barely begun. But for the first time in decades, it was being fought on African terms, with words sharper than bullets and dreams too bold to colonize. And across the world, the empire that had grown fat on silence felt something it had not felt in generations: fear.